Hi guys, it's that history guy again. Today we're talking about history's ultimate overachiever, Alexander the Great. This is a guy who conquered most of the known world before his 33rd birthday, founded over 70 cities, and somehow found time to have philosophical debates with naked philosophers living in barrels. You know that friend who makes you feel bad about yourself because they seem to accomplish everything effortlessly? Alexander was like that, but for entire civilizations. By the time most people today are figuring out what to do with their lives, Alexander had already done everything there was to do, and then some. So buckle up because we're about to explore the life of a man who turned world domination from a fantasy into a career goal and actually pulled it off. Alexander was born in 356 BC in Macedonia, which was basically ancient Greece's scrappy northern neighbor. Think of Macedonia as that smaller country that everyone underestimated until they suddenly took over everything. Kind of like how people feel about Canada, but with more swords. His father, Philip II, was already a pretty impressive king who had turned Macedonia from a backwater kingdom into a regional powerhouse. But Philip's greatest achievement might have been hiring the best tutor money could buy for young Alexander, Aristotle. Yes, that Aristotle, one of history's greatest philosophers, became Alexander's personal teacher. Imagine having Aristotle as your high school teacher. Today we're going to discuss ethics, politics, biology, and oh, by the way, here's how you conquer the world. The man literally taught Alexander everything from military strategy to the proper way to treat conquered peoples. It was like having a PhD program designed specifically for future world emperors. But even as a kid, Alexander showed signs of his legendary ambition. When he was 13, a horse dealer brought an enormous black stallion to Philip's court. The horse was beautiful, but completely wild. It had injured several experienced horsemen, and everyone was ready to give up on it. Young Alexander, however, noticed something the adults had missed. The horse was afraid of its own shadow. So this 13-year-old kid walks up to this massive, terrified animal, calmly turns it to face the sun so it can't see its shadow, and within minutes, he's riding it like they're best friends. Philip was so impressed, he bought the horse on the spot and allegedly said, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions, for Macedonia is too small for you." The horse's name was Bucephalus, and it would carry Alexander across 3 continents. Not bad for a teenager's first impression. When Alexander was 20, his father Philip was assassinated at his daughter's wedding. Ancient royal families had drama. Suddenly, Alexander found himself king of Macedonia, with a bunch of Greek city-states thinking this was their chance to rebel against Macedonian rule. Alexander's response was swift and, frankly, a little terrifying. When the city of Thebes revolted, he didn't just defeat them, he completely destroyed the city and sold the entire population into slavery. Then he left one house standing, the house where the poet Pindar had lived, because Alexander was cultured like that. Nothing says I'm a sophisticated conqueror like committing genocide while respecting poetry. The message to the rest of Greece was clear. I may be young, but I'm not someone you want to mess with. The other Greek cities quickly decided that supporting Alexander's upcoming campaign against Persia sounded like a fantastic idea. And what a campaign it was going to be. Alexander didn't just want to raid Persia for some quick loot. He wanted to conquer the entire Persian Empire, the largest empire the world had ever seen. It stretched from Turkey to India, encompassing most of the civilized world. Alexander looked at this impossible task and thought, challenge accepted. In 334 BC, at age 22, Alexander crossed into Asia with about 35,000 men. His first stop was the ruins of Troy, where he performed sacrifices and raced naked around Achilles' tomb, because apparently even world conquest needed some theatrical flair. Plus, it was a nice way to remind everyone that he saw himself as the new Achilles, except with better strategic planning and considerably more ambition. What made Alexander so successful wasn't just his military genius, though he definitely had that in spades. It was his combination of strategic brilliance, tactical innovation, and absolutely unshakable confidence. The man never lost a single battle in 15 years of constant warfare. Not one. His first major victory was at the Battle of Granicus, where he personally led the cavalry charge and nearly got himself killed in hand-to-hand combat. This became Alexander's signature move, leading from the front like he was invincible. His men followed him because they genuinely believed he couldn't be killed, and honestly, given how many times he should have died and didn't, they might have been right. But Alexander wasn't just about brute force. When he conquered cities, he often adopted their customs and married into local noble families. When he took Egypt, he declared himself pharaoh and founded Alexandria. Yes, that Alexandria, which became one of the most important cities in the ancient world. He didn't just conquer people, he convinced them to join his vision of a massive, multicultural empire. His greatest victory came at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC, where he faced Darius III, the king of kings of Persia, with the largest army Persia could muster. Darius had war elephants, scythed chariots, and vastly superior numbers. Alexander had brilliant tactics and the absolute conviction that he was destined to win. The battle was a masterpiece of military strategy. Alexander feinted an attack on one side, drew the Persian forces out of position, then punched through a gap in their center with his elite cavalry. Darius, seeing Alexander charging straight at him with murder in his eyes, decided that discretion was the better part of valor and fled the battlefield. The Persian Empire, which had dominated the Middle East for 2 centuries, effectively ended that day. Now, here's where Alexander gets really interesting as a person. Success went to his head in ways that were both impressive and slightly unhinged. After conquering Persia, he started demanding that people prostrate themselves before him, a Persian custom that Greeks found absolutely humiliating. When his old tutor's nephew, Callisthenes, refused to bow down, Alexander had him arrested and eventually executed. So much for those philosophy lessons about treating people with dignity. Alexander was learning that absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it makes you do really awkward things at dinner parties. He also began claiming that his real father wasn't Philip, but Zeus himself. This wasn't entirely unusual for ancient rulers, but Alexander seemed to actually believe it. He consulted oracles, performed elaborate religious ceremonies, and generally acted like someone who thought he was literally divine. His generals went along with it because, hey, he was still winning battles, but you can imagine the eye-rolling behind his back. The drinking didn't help. Alexander and his Macedonian companions were legendary drinkers, even by ancient standards. At one party, Alexander got so drunk he killed one of his best friends, Clitus, in an argument. Clitus had saved Alexander's life in battle, but that didn't stop Alexander from running him through with a spear when Clitus criticized his adoption of Persian customs. Alexander immediately regretted it and spent 3 days locked in his tent, refusing to eat or drink, convinced he'd lost the favor of the gods. His friends had to drag him out and convince him to keep conquering things. It was like having to give a pep talk to a depressed superhero. But perhaps the most telling story about Alexander's personality involves his meeting with Diogenes, the famous Cynic philosopher who lived in a barrel and owned nothing. When Alexander found Diogenes sunbathing, he offered to grant him any wish. Diogenes looked up at this world conqueror and said, "Yeah, could you move? You're blocking my sunlight." Alexander's response, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." Here was a man who had everything, admitting he envied someone who had chosen to live with nothing. It's one of history's most perfect philosophical moments. Alexander's final campaigns took him into India, where he faced new challenges: war elephants, monsoons, and increasingly exhausted troops who just wanted to go home after 8 years of constant fighting. At the Battle of Hydaspes, he defeated King Porus and his elephant corps, but it was a costly victory. After the battle, Alexander found Porus wounded and captured. When asked how he wished to be treated, Porus replied, "As a king." Alexander was so impressed by this answer that he not only let Porus keep his kingdom, but expanded it. This was Alexander at his best, recognizing courage and honor, even in his enemies. But his troops had had enough. When Alexander announced his plan to march further into India and then loop back to conquer Arabia, his army basically staged a mutiny. These were men who had followed him across 3 continents, but they drew the line at conquering infinite continents. Alexander gave one of history's most famous speeches, reminding his men of all their victories and promising them even greater glory. The response was total silence. Finally, one of his generals stood up and said, essentially, "We're tired, we're homesick, and we want to see our families." Even Alexander couldn't argue with that. So, they turned around and began the long journey home. But Alexander being Alexander, he couldn't just take the easy route. Instead, he decided to march his army through the Gedrosian Desert, one of the most hostile places on Earth. It was like deciding to take a scenic detour through hell. The desert march was a disaster. Thousands of soldiers died of thirst, heat, and exhaustion. Alexander, typically, shared every hardship with his men, at one point refusing water when there wasn't enough for everyone. But by the time they reached civilization, his army was a shadow of its former self. Alexander made it back to Babylon, where he began planning his next campaign, because of course he did. He wanted to conquer Arabia, then maybe swing by and pick up Western Europe. The man simply didn't understand the concept of enough. But in 323 BC, at a banquet in Babylon, Alexander fell ill. Some historians think it was malaria or typhoid fever. Others suggest he was poisoned, though that's probably less likely. The most probable cause? Alexander had spent 13 years pushing his body to its absolute limits, drinking heavily and refusing to slow down. His body finally said, "No more." As he lay dying, his generals asked who should inherit his empire. Alexander's response was either "to the strongest" or "to Crateros." The sources disagree, probably because Alexander was delirious and everyone was panicking. Either way, it wasn't exactly a clear succession plan. Without Alexander to hold it together, his empire immediately began falling apart. His generals carved it up into separate kingdoms, fought each other for decades, and generally proved that building an empire is a lot easier than keeping one together. Alexander died at 32, having accomplished more in his short life than most civilizations manage in centuries. He had created a cultural fusion that would influence art, philosophy, and politics for 1,000 years. The Hellenistic world he created spread Greek culture from Spain to India, laying the groundwork for both the Roman Empire and the spread of Christianity. So what do we make of Alexander the Great? He was simultaneously one of history's greatest military geniuses and a deeply flawed human being. He spread culture and learning across continents, but also left a trail of destruction that was breathtaking even by ancient standards. Alexander proved that with enough ambition, intelligence, and sheer stubborn determination, one person really can change the world. Whether that's always a good thing is another question entirely. He remains the gold standard for military leadership, the cautionary tale about unchecked ambition, and proof that sometimes the most impossible dreams are the ones most worth pursuing.